Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Johnson. I am the Executive Director for the Center of Ethics and the Rule of Law. And it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you here tonight in collaboration with the Annenberg Public Policy Center and the Perry World House. I think we're going to have a fascinating fireside chat, sans the fire, here tonight. And we couldn't be more pleased to have our distinguished guest here, the former Secretary of Homeland Security, Jeh Johnson, is right here, and Professor Claire Finkelstein from the University of Pennsylvania Law School will be moderating this fireside chat this evening. And I see some of our former interns here. It's great to see you, and put out a plug for future interns that we're going to have another summer class doing them. So I want to cut right to the chase here and introduce Professor Finkelstein.
Wonderful, thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to say that we're so grateful to the Perry World House for hosting us here for this and for their many collaborations, as well as for a conference that we're going to hold over the next couple of days, a working group session on the topic of domestic violent extremism. So we're extremely fortunate to have Secretary Jeh Johnson join us as the kickoff to this event. And we're also very grateful to our partners and hosts where our offices are, the Annenberg Public Policy Center. We have many different kinds of collaborations. Excuse me, I'm being signaled that I need to talk into the mic. How's that? Whoop. Many different collaborations with the Annenberg Public Policy Center. And as I say, our offices are housed at APPC, which is right down Locust Walk. We are very pleased that this several-day conference that we're kicking off is co-sponsored by both the Perry World House and the Annenberg Public Policy Center. Tomorrow at the same time, there will be a panel discussion on the topic of domestic violent extremism, in which we'll in some ways get into more of the detailed weeds of the topic with experts from various different areas. But right now, I'm absolutely delighted and honored to be able to have a conversation with Secretary Jeh Johnson. Secretary Johnson is a partner in the law firm of Paul, Weiss, Rifkind, Wharton, and Garrison, who in public life was Secretary of Homeland Security from 2013 to 2017. He was also General Counsel of the Department of Defense from 2009 to 2012, General Counsel of the Department of the Air Force from 1998 to 2001, and an Assistant United States Attorney in the Southern District of New York from 1989 to 1991. Secretary Johnson is a 2022 recipient of the Ellis Island Medal of Honor, a 2021 recipient of the American Lawyers Lifetime Achievement Award as an American statesman who has devoted his career to the public interest, and a 2018 recipient of the Ronald Reagan Peace Through Strength Award, presented at the Reagan Presidential Library for contributing greatly to the defense of our nation and guiding us through turbulent times with courage and wisdom. He is on the board of directors of Lockheed Martin Corporation, U.S. Steel, the Council on Foreign Relations, the 9/11 Memorial and Museum in New York City, the Center for a New American Security, and is a trustee of Columbia University. He is also a frequent commentator on national and homeland security matters on NBC's Meet the Press, CBS, MSNBC, CNN, Fox, CNBC, NPR, etc., and has written op-eds for the Washington Post, Lawfare, USA Today, the Wall Street Journal, and elsewhere. He is also a host of a classic R&B radio show on WBGO.
I'm glad you didn't leave that out.
88.3, based in Newark, New Jersey. And finally, he is a graduate of Morehouse College, Columbia Law School, and the recipient of 12 honorary degrees. Please join me in welcoming Secretary Jeh Johnson. Secretary Johnson, we are thrilled to be able to talk to you, especially at this moment in time when we see...
So am I. I got off jury duty so I could be here.
Yeah, right, exactly. And the perception, of course, is that we have a real rise in extremism in this country, an increase in violence. President Biden recently gave a rather extraordinary speech in which he highlighted these issues, directly calling out MAGA Republicans. And of course, we had the insurrection of January 6th and a real threat to our electoral system. Do you think that there is indeed an increase in violent extremism in the country, or is it that we're focused on it in a new way, particularly now that we're starting to perceive the cost to democracy and the threat that it poses?
First of all, Claire, it's nice to be here. It's nice to be here in Philadelphia. I'm really glad I'm here because for a while, as you know, it was a real nail biter because I was summoned to jury duty yesterday. And interestingly, in the questionnaire that we all had to answer for jury service, it wasn't until question 28 that you would elicit the fact that I was Secretary of Homeland Security. I first had to disclose my favorite TV shows, the bumper stickers that I have, what do members of my family do, have I ever been the victim of a crime, have I ever witnessed a crime, have I ever committed a crime. It wasn't until question 28 that the judge would find out that I ran the largest law enforcement department of our US government. But the defendant pled guilty to his homicide and justice was done without me. So you ask a very big question. The first thing that I think of is there has always been in this country domestic violent extremism. My great-grandfather was a Baptist preacher in Southwest Virginia. He pastored his church for 41 years, 1890 to 1932, in Bristol, Virginia. The church is still there. And my grandfather, when you're a Black Baptist preacher at the turn of the century in Southwest Virginia, you were the spiritual leader, you were the trust and estates advisor, you were the marriage counselor, but occasionally you'd have to also break up a lynching, which he did from time to time. So we've lived with domestic violent extremism almost the entirety of this republic. We've lived with racism, we've lived with hatred, we've lived with religious bigotry. What is different now is that more recently, we have had national leadership that, through their rhetoric, has validated the hatred, peeled the lid off of it, legitimized it, and encouraged it, which is how we wound up with an insurrection on the US Capitol on January 6th, which is how we wound up with Charlottesville in August 2017. But even white nationalist violent extremism has been with us for a while. The Timothy McVeigh bombing of Oklahoma City in 1995, just hatred of the federal government.
Which Merrick Garland prosecuted.
Correct. But it has been validated now by our national leaders. Yes, I'm talking about Donald Trump and others who have decided to engage in, as a tactic, stoking that resentment, anger, frustration for their own political objectives, which makes it much more dangerous. There's a study that you and I have talked about, done by a professor at the University of Chicago named Robert Pape. And he's done a series of studies now that are getting a lot of attention. And I've been a supporter of his research that he started after January 6th. The first thing he did, which is very interesting, he studied the demographics of those who were arrested for January 6th. And he found that, first of all, they're more educated than you would have expected. And most of those arrested for that insurrection come from blue counties in blue states that Joe Biden won, not remote, rural, red counties in red states, not in northernmost Wyoming or Idaho, but in, places like Putnam County, New York, or Essex County, New Jersey, where I live. And you connect all those dots, and that they were motivated because they believed the election was stolen, and they're motivated by the great replacement theory. And these are people who feel threatened by the increasing diversity around them in close proximity in their very communities. And that prejudice, that hatred, that resentment, that fear has been validated and stoked and brought to the surface and boiled over.
And then fused with the issue of election denial.
Yes,
And
right.
that's a game changer, right? Because we
Right.
have whatever the number is.
It's a game changer, right.
13 million
right.
people. who
Right,
are
and
ready
Professor Pape said, I mean, the other aspect of his study, thank you, is, according to surveys, if you extrapolate, an estimated 13 million people in this country are willing to resort to violence or support violence to restore Donald Trump to office.
and believe he is still the rightful office holder, right?
Correct, right. Daniel Patrick Moynihan used to say, you're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts. We've enabled people to have their own facts now, and which is why some 60% of Republicans say that they believe the election was stolen.
Right. So this is a genie we don't get to just stuff back in a bottle, right? And in some sense, we talked about this earlier. I almost analogize it to a cancer that's been removed, that's metastasized, because it is now sort of spread so widely in our population and has so many, excuse me, thank you, different aspects to it. Are we in a new phase of extremism where it becomes a kind of part of everyday life? We have right here in Pennsylvania a very well attended to governor's race in which one of the candidates posed in a Confederate uniform. And when that came out, in an earlier day, there would have been no question that, person might have very well stepped down. But it is not seen anymore as preclusive of holding office that you're continue to be a believer in the Confederacy.
Yeah, some politicians, some people running for elective office have embarked upon the strategy of outrage, just being the most extremist, playing to Donald Trump, playing to MAGA Republicans as a path to somehow getting elected. So that's one new phenomenon. I think the fundamental question to ask about the American political scene is, in 2016, we as a nation embarked upon a really dangerous experiment. Out of our frustration politically, we elected a man to the job of president who had no experience in public office, no understanding or respect for the rule of law, no understanding or respect for the Constitution, and fascist autocratic impulses. That's who we elected to this very powerful position in the United States government. 4 years later, so we elected the most inexperienced person in history to the job of president. And then after that, we swung the pendulum back and elected the most experienced person ever in federal office to the job of president. And the question is whether that is a return to normalcy or whether Joe Biden is the last gasp of what we used to know as normal, and we're headed down this longer term path, this longer term descent into political extremism?
Right.
And I don't have the answer to that question. I don't have a crystal ball. I think it depends upon political engagement, not apathy. The good news in all of this is that more and more people, every presidential election cycle, are voting. I don't know whether you can credit social media for that or whatever, but more people are engaged in the political process of voting, not less. Not, the good news is we're all on both sides, more and more engaged in going to the polls, casting a ballot, and to a large extent, we've enabled it through voting by mail and the like. But the longer term trend line, whether this type of political extremism is here with us to stay, I don't have the answer to that question.
And it's interesting that you mention higher and higher rates of voting, because one of the hallmarks, notable features of this week's Italian election, in which a far-right government has come in, is that voting turnout was very low.
Well, a lot of this, unfortunately, the root of a lot of the right-wing backlash in France, in Italy, the United States, and elsewhere is immigration. Immigration is a hot-button red meat issue, and politicians stoke the fear of a great replacement to animate voters to vote out of fear of migration. The browning of America.
Yeah.
And the reality is migrants on our southern border are people who are desperate. They are harmless for the most part, almost entirely simply seeking a better life in our country and fleeing the most violent region in the world for a better life, to the point where they're even willing to send their own children without adult supervision. And the reality is that migrants add to our workforce in places where it's needed. If we could have comprehensive immigration reform to develop a more sophisticated guest worker program, we could solve a lot of our problems. But unfortunately, the root of a lot of this is immigration, and the fear of immigration, regular, irregular, and Trump and aided and abetted by Stephen Miller,
Right.
played to that.
Right. And it became a sort of
When I was in office,
catalyst.
in 2015, we had the lowest number of apprehensions on our southern border in 20 years. We had in FY 2015, we had 315,000 apprehensions on our southern border. That number had decreased through a lot of investment in border security in Obama's administration, Bush's administration, Clinton's administration, and improved economies in the source countries. But if you took a poll of the American public in 2015, is illegal migration better or worse than it was 20 years ago? 55% of Americans would say it's worse, because the perception was the numbers were higher, when in fact the numbers were a fraction of what they used to be. And so I embarked on a reality tour, and I'd give speeches with colorful PowerPoint graphs showing the 20-year trend lines. And I learned in Washington, you have to repeat yourself 35 times before anybody will hear you finally. And so even the Washington Times started writing articles. Border immigration is, it's lower than it has been in 20 years. Because finally, after the 32nd time, they decided to write the story. But a lot of what is at the root of a lot of this is simply the fear of migration.
So if we go back to January 6th, and I'd really like to ask you about the current strategy of the Department of Justice, the approach of Merrick Garland to prosecuting those cases. I think there's starting to be more confidence in the Attorney General and the Justice Department, but there's been a lot of criticism that he has not acted energetically enough. And in particular, there's been there have been few individuals prosecuted for seditious conspiracy, for example. So it's been sort of lower level crimes and relatively few trespassing, for example, relatively few high level leaders prosecuted, though the level is sort of creeping up. And of course, no members of the former administration yet. So, tell us your thoughts about how you think DOJ is doing and what you'd like to see happen there.
Well, the good news is I think we have an attorney general who is a man of integrity and principle, and he's careful. Mm-hmm. Surrounded by a lot of lawyers, some of whom I know, who are very thorough mm-hmm. and want to have every last piece of evidence dissected and analyzed before they will make a move toward indictment. I think that, and I'm not on the inside, I don't have inside information about what's going on in justice. It is obvious that the Department of Justice is under a lot of pressure because of the January 6th hearings to act and do more than just prosecute those who were on the ground, who were involved in the insurrection. And it seems that from what we see in the public space, that justice has gone to another level in their investigation.
Right.
Whatever happens, first of all, what could happen, which I find very interesting, is that somehow Trump escapes federal prosecution and he's taken down by two very courageous, concerted black women, one in New York State, the other one in Fulton County, Georgia, who are investigating him and going after him.
Though the New York, we should add though to this, the New York Attorney General has made a criminal referral to the Department of Justice.
I know,
and so it may of course be a partnership between New York and the feds.
Whatever happens, prosecution, no prosecution, prosecution for one thing but not another, I think our Department of Justice is going to have a really good explanation for what they have done or not done. Mm-hmm. The other thing I believe, and this is a lawyer's temptation, but I hope doesn't happen. The thing that I believe is if there is a prosecutable case against the former president, they should not just go for the Al Capone route, the quick and easy hit. Right. So for example, somebody pointed out to me that it's a violation of, there's an element, I haven't read this myself, I need to go look this up, but I've been told that there's an element in the Espionage Act that makes criminal the refusal to return something that is national security sensitive.
Yes.
So that's just by fact that he took it and he kept it when he was a private citizen, right. And then he refused to return it when asked multiple times, you could argue is the offense. But I think it's in the national interest. If there is an indictable case against senior most officials of our government for insurrection, let's call it what it is. And in my view, a lot of people put a lot of different labels on January 6th, wasn't it terrorism? Legally, you could argue that what happened on January 6th fits within the definition of an act of terrorism. But in my view, what happened on January 6th is the very definition of an insurrection. And the insurrection statute punishes not only those who engage in insurrection, but those who incite the insurrection and those who give aid and comfort thereto.
And then also, let's not forget that under the 14th Amendment, Section 3, if anyone who is prosecuted for sedition or insurrection cannot hold office again.
Right. And so I don't know all the evidence. I don't know all the thinking. I'm sure the thinking that is going into this is way more sophisticated than what I'm spouting off here on this stage. There'll be free speech, First Amendment defenses to any such prosecution for giving a speech or advocating something around an election result. I also tend to believe that an aggressive prosecutor, like, the Democratic version of a Chris Christie or a Rudy Giuliani in his early days. I used to work for Rudy Giuliani. I was hired by him in 1988. Would say, an aggressive prosecutor would say, this is an indictable case, let's go. What are you waiting for? Yeah. Merrick Garland, I wouldn't characterize as an aggressive prosecutor. I think he's very careful and judicious, because he used to be a judge. So we'll see what's going to happen. I do believe that when you look at the various different criminal offenses that are potential bases for indictment, that we're in the range of what an aggressive prosecutor would be willing to take on.
So let's imagine now, to stay with this topic one more minute, and then we'll pivot to something else, but let's just imagine that Merrick Garland decides to indict Donald Trump, whether it's for the criminal referral on the New York financial crime.
This could get really crazy. Imagine someone who is an active major party candidate for president who was out on bail.
Right, or maybe not, right? Maybe not. He can, as he's fond of pointing out, he can run for office from a prison cell. Nothing.
I mean, the only rationale I've heard articulated is running for president is a good way to avoid prosecution. I mean, that's not a reason to put somebody to president. So
absolutely. So let's imagine this happens, and let's go back to the topic of domestic violence extremism. There were those who say that the Justice Department should not prosecute Donald Trump because there would be massive violence in the streets. What's your view of that?
I don't believe that the threat and the possibility of violence in the streets is justification for not prosecuting someone when they could be prosecuted and convicted. I think this has gotten too big.
Yeah.
I think that my own analysis is that we do more to damage our democracy by saying that certain people are above the rule of law and we can't risk violence in the streets by following the evidence and following the law. This is a different era than 1974 when Ford pardoned Nixon. Nixon was guilty of an abuse of power. I believe what Donald Trump did and what the people around him did was actually way worse than Watergate.
Oh, yeah.
I believe Donald Trump incited an insurrection on the US Capitol. That's worse than Watergate. Watergate was a break-in and an abuse of power to try to cover it up.
Well, and even Richard Nixon, when he resigned, of course, remember his resignation speech, said probably quite genuinely that he was resigning because he thought it was better for the country.
Right. And in that environment, I actually believe Ford was right to pardon him. We're in a different environment now, and I don't think that, I think that the considerations are different. And there have to be consequences for the actions that were taken in the waning days of the Trump administration.
Well, let's talk about the Mar-a-Lago situation a little bit.
And I also believe that, and I think the January 6th hearings has shown this, even though our nation is sharply divided, half the nation believes X, the other half believes Y. If there's a public airing of the evidence, a truth commission, so to speak, about what happened, like the January 6th hearings, more and more Americans who are in the middle will see and understand the seriousness of what happened.
I think that the January 6th committee has done an excellent job in laying all that out in a detailed way. And in fact, the next hearing was supposed to be today, delayed because of the storm. So let's talk a little bit about the Mar-a-Lago situation, as though there weren't enough that DOJ is looking at with regard to Donald Trump. Now we have this situation with the documents. And, we have a president who on the way out the door took classified documents with him, received a subpoena from the National Archives and did not respond to that subpoena by turning over the documents. Then very interestingly, we have his lawyers saying eventually that all documents have been turned over when they hadn't been. Extraordinary position for those lawyers to be in now.
For those law students here, rule number one, being a criminal defense lawyer, is don't get dragged into the criminal conspiracy of your client, okay? Right. How to avoid that?
We have reportedly highly sensitive nuclear documents that can't even be declassified, can't permissibly be declassified. And we have a former president saying, oh yeah, I declassified them all just by thinking about it. Now, looking at
Standing order, anything that I took out of the Oval Office is declassified.
right. So how could DOJ not respond? As many people have said, and I'm sure you yourself would say this, suppose you had taken classified documents on that level as you walked out of the administration. I assume the FBI be knocking on your door.
I'd be in pretrial detention right now.
Yeah, right. Okay, so how can, and a lot of people said, why is this taking so long? What is DOJ doing? He's still potentially sitting on some of those documents, and right?
Well, yeah, lawyers take a long time. Lawyers don't meet any deadline before it's time. And I like to say to younger lawyers who work for me, you don't need more time, you just need a deadline.
Right.
I'm giving you a weekend to do this. And you give lawyers a deadline, they can, especially prosecutors, they're very careful, they're very methodical, they have their list, they want to understand every piece of evidence before they go out publicly with a charge. So let's talk about the ABCs of this. And we have experts here. We have the former general counsel of the CIA, so you don't need me. But first, it's important to realize that a document is not classified. The information in the document is classified. And a document, like this napkin, could have 10 different pieces of information on it, some of which are classified, some of which are not. And they could be classified at different levels. Secret, top secret SCI. It depends upon the specific sentence or the specific paragraph. And so you could have a document that says Jeh Johnson was born September 11th, 1957. That's not classified. And then the very next sentence could contain classified information. And then the next sentence after that could contain classified information at an even higher level. So information that exists throughout the federal government is what is classified. A document, a piece of paper in and of itself, is not classified. And the fundamentals to classifying and declassifying a document is that everybody knows how to treat that information. And so if you declassify something, part and parcel of that is telling everybody else who has the information, this is now declassified. So you can take it out of your safe and put it on top of your desk. Or you can now talk about it publicly because It's been declassified. So that's principle number one. Principle number two is that the whole system of classification exists by virtue of executive order, not law, not a statute. Right. So the system of classification was created by an executive order signed by the president after World War II, and it's been reiterated over and over again in various different executive orders. And so by definition, because the classification system has been created by executive action, it can be undone or shortcut by executive action. The president could decide by himself
to reclassify.
Well, we'll get to reclassify in a second. The president could decide, I'm declassifying this. I've got this very important world leader coming to see me, and I want to share with him this very important piece of intelligence. Very often, intelligence is classified as top secret no foreign, which means no foreign national could see this. And the president himself, all by himself in the Oval Office 5 minutes before the meeting, could decide, in theory, I'm going to show this to this foreign leader, so I'm going to change the classification of this to TS, no foreign, except this country, because I'm going to show it to this foreign leader. The president could do that because he's the commander-in-chief, and this derives from his commander-in-chief authority. That would be deeply unwise without consulting all of those agencies that have a stake in the classification to find out what the implications of that would be. But a president could declassify something on his own without consulting anybody in legal theory. A president could also, on his own, decide, I'm going to take this top secret document and I'm going to take it home with me, and I'm going to read it at home tonight, and I'm going to leave it in my den overnight, and I'll bring it back.
Carpet.
I'll bring it back tomorrow, because he's the president. He's the commander-in-chief. He gets to do that, where all the rest of us have to keep it in a skiff, in a safe. He's the president. He's the boss. In theory, he has the authority to do that. So in theory, and this is, again, unwise, imprudent, a little reckless. In theory, a president could decide, I'm going to take this top secret document with me to Mar-a-Lago, and I'm going to keep it in my safe in Mar-a-Lago for as long as I'm president. Now, the moment you stop being president and you become a private citizen, you put yourself in legal jeopardy because you're still holding that document. You're not president anymore. But when a president takes a classified document, this is why the people who thought this whole thing up really don't understand this. When the president decides he wants to take something to Mar-a-Lago with him that's top secret, that doesn't mean you're declassifying it. It just simply means you're exercising your authority as president to treat it the way you want to treat it and handle it the way you want to handle it. But the moment you stop being president, you got to give it back, because it's the property of the US government. It's not yours to keep, even if it's a love letter from, the president of South Korea. It's not yours. It's the property of the US government, Presidential Records Act. So this notion that the president declassified something by leaving it, walking out of the West Wing with it, and that he necessarily therefore declassified it is just, frankly, I can't think of a better word than bullshit. Because A, he didn't have to do that, and B, part and parcel of a declassification is telling everyone else that holds the information, this now is declassified. What's the purpose of declassifying something if you don't tell everybody else who has it, this is hereby declassified? It's like saying the speed limit on the New Jersey Turnpike is whatever the governor happens to be driving at that particular moment. But he's not going to tell anybody how fast he's driving. So what could happen in this whole battle is the lawyers are pushed to say, Donald Trump, while he was still president, declassified the following 10 things, which he kept at Mar-a-Lago. Therefore, he was entitled to keep them. The interesting question is whether the moment he does that, President Biden could reclassify them and say, aha, you declassified them, it's really sensitive stuff, I am hereby reclassifying it, which I think legally you could do.
No, I take it even if Donald Trump had declassified the documents, they're still property of the US government.
Correct.
And so he still doesn't get to keep them.
He still potentially violated the Espionage Act, right?
Now, there's this argument, of course, and Judge Eileen Cannon, Trump appointee, who came up with this opinion, which has been roundly criticized really on all sides of the aisle, making the argument that because the documents might be privileged, first of all, she stayed the DOJ's investigation to the extent they made use of the documents. And second of all, said we need to appoint a special master to figure out whether or not the documents are privileged. And I take it the issue of whether the documents are privileged really is neither here nor there, because they're still property of the US government, whether they're privileged, whether they've been declassified, and still need to be returned to
Well, the whole topic of the scope of the executive privilege and the scope of attorney-client privilege in the White House is a mess. It's a jumbled mess. Well, let's just call it what it is. There's no clear answer. You can ask 10 experts about the scope of executive privilege and you can get 10 different answers. And so it is a subject in desperate need of clarity by somebody. But typically, executive privilege shields direct communications between the president and his closest advisors, but it has to be my experience, it has to be affirmatively invoked. I hereby assert executive privilege with respect to this memo, therefore you cannot turn it over to the press or in litigation or something like. It has to be affirmatively invoked. And my understanding, and again, there's no clear answer on this, is that it can only be invoked by the incumbent president.
The current president holds the privilege, right?
Right,
Very
but
clearly.
but this opinion from the judge kind of cast all kinds of doubt over that.
Right.
And I still don't get clarity about what attorney-client privilege means between the White House counsel and the president. Everybody says, well, the privilege doesn't run to the president, it runs to the office of the president. That distinction, once you're in office, kind of goes away, I think.
But once you're out, it comes back. It's a very important point, which is that the privilege doesn't attach to the man. He's out of office. It's a privilege held by the current president of the United States.
Yes, but if I'm the White House counsel, I would argue that even though that might be right, I personally, as a member of the bar, have a professional obligation to keep secret
Yes.
the counsel I gave this person I regarded as my client, even though it was on taxpayer money, unless I'm told by him that he's waived the privilege.
Right. So while we're going a little far afield here, let me just ask your thoughts on a decision that just came down
So
yesterday.
anyway, that whole topic there's a lot of doubt around it to me.
Absolutely.
scope of it
And here's another expression of that doubt, which I really think has to do with the confusion around the scope of presidential authority, the expanding nature of presidential authority, and the arguments that have been made, unfortunately, kind of abusing some of those notions. And so here we have another one. Interestingly, the DOJ has taken Donald Trump's side in the litigation with E. Jean Carroll. And now we have a decision by,
Have the Department of Justice defending Donald Trump against the, yeah,
it's hard to
really
believe.
bizarre, yeah.
Fortunately, when Mo Brooks came along, who had given speeches on January 6th and was part of the instigating crew, and said, wait a second, you're defending him, now you got to defend me too under the Westfall Act. DOJ said, no, that's going too far. But meanwhile, we have this decision by a judge in the E. Jean Carroll case saying that Donald Trump was a federal employee at the time that he uttered potentially libelous statements about E. Jean Carroll, and that they're going to leave it to the Court of Appeals to say whether or not he was acting in his official capacity. If the Court of Appeals says he was acting in his official capacity, Donald Trump is dismissed from that lawsuit, and the Department of Justice is obligated to take the case up under the Westfall Act on his behalf. A sort of extraordinary possibility. Sharp dissent from one judge on the three-judge panel saying this is nonsense. He was acting in his personal capacity. It's irrelevant that he was a federal employee. And moreover, there's no one above him as federal employee. So I'm just wondering, is this sort of part and parcel of the same confusion that we don't even know, whether or not Donald Trump is considered a federal employee acting in his official capacity in a lawsuit against him?
Well, sometimes really complicated subjects, really complicated legal subjects boil down to what makes common sense. Is it common sense for the Department of Justice on taxpayer dollars to defend a former president who is now a private citizen in a lawsuit brought by a woman he allegedly assaulted sexually?
Allegedly raped.
Does that make common sense to anybody in this room? It doesn't to me.
It does to Merrick Garland, apparently.
Well, yeah. So, I used to have these disputes with the Department of Justice, very different context, about whether in a Bivens action, everybody here know what a Bivens action is, where you're a federal employee is sued in his personal capacity for something he did while in office.
Directly from the Constitution.
Right, and I used to have these arguments with the Department of Justice about whether they'd be willing to represent members of the U.S. military in Bivens actions brought. And my boss at the time, Robert Gates, the Secretary of Defense, believed very strongly that if you're sued by, let's say, a former detainee because of something you did in uniform in the U.S. military, the Department of Justice should step up and defend you, even if it's a Bivens action. We used to have these back and forth disputes with DOJ, and that's clearly a context where the service member should expect, whether he's active duty or retired, that he's going to be defended by the U.S. Department of Justice for something he did while in uniform, following orders.
Assuming he's following orders.
Yes.
Now, if the orders are illegal, that's a different matter.
Well, even in that context, I think you could argue that they're still entitled to DOJ representation. But this one is so far afield, and we end up in these kinds of absurd scenarios when you have someone who occupied the office of president who pushed the outer limits of his authority and was willing to engage on a daily basis in abuses of power and viewed the executive branch of the federal government as his family business, and everybody works for him and does whatever he tells them to do.
So let's talk about a sort of path.
Donald Trump used to, there were, every once in a while, he'd say things in a certain way that were so revealing. So most presidents, when questioned about their authority, would say, I have the authority to do this. I have the authority to declassify this.
Right.
As president, I have this authority. You're wondering where I'm going with this. Donald Trump would often say, I have the right to do this. I have the right to do this, which is so revealing about his mentality in the job. He viewed himself as sort of the antagonist who was constantly challenging authority, and would think, well, I have the right to take this document home with me. And to me, it's so revealing. It reveals the mentality of a person who never should have been in the job in the first place, who never fully understood what he was doing.
Well, and to follow up your point on that, there's a wonderful moment, if you listen to the argument in the Second Circuit before it went up to the Supreme Court, of the Trump v. Vance case. And the lawyers are arguing a strategy that they did not use in the Supreme Court, that the president not just cannot be indicted, but that a sitting president cannot, in fact, be criminally investigated, right? That's their argument. So the judge—
questioned, subpoenaed, whatever, right.
Right, so the judge says, well, let me ask you, so suppose the president starts shooting on Fifth Avenue, right? The classic example. And the lawyers say, no, impeachment is the remedy. You can't stop him, you can't investigate him, you can't arrest him. He can go on a shooting spree and you have to wait for Congress to impeach him. right? Now that view did not hold sway, and even in a very conservative court that's very inclined to presidential authority, in fact, the Supreme Court ruled against the president. But the idea, and the idea that lawyers will actually get up there and say, that's right, a president can shoot someone on Fifth Avenue with no criminal repercussions, shows how far the discussion about executive authority has come and how far.
Well, we do have the former acting attorney general sitting here. My understanding, nod your head no at any point where I say something that's wrong. My understanding is that the various OLC opinions that say the president, when he's president, cannot be prosecuted, are based in part on an understanding of the Constitution and in part on policy. If that is true, it seems to me that an attorney general in some future administration could, even on instructions from his boss, the president, simply tear that up and withdraw it.
Correct.
And renounce it.
In fact, my co-author,
And a better question is, why don't we ask candidates for president to take as a campaign position that you will tear up that OLC opinion because no man in this country is above the law?
So my co-author, Richard Painter, and I have a 100-page article on this topic, which I will send you, that we've recently published.
Got an uneasy look on his face. Maybe he doesn't agree.
Right.
Just remember that you don't have to go that far. Bill Clinton was sued in a civil action while he was the president. While there are questions about when the proceeding ought to take place, he still was deposed during the time he was president.
Absolutely.
Right, he was.
Absolutely. So let's go back to our topic of domestic violent extremism and shift gears a little bit, and we're just going to go for a few more minutes and then let the audience in more officially. But let's talk about the role of education, in particular civic education. This is something that is near and dear to many of our hearts, and something the Center is working on in conjunction with the Annenberg Public Policy Center. We have a lot of hopes pinned on the idea that if you engage in widespread efforts of civic education and try to raise the level of awareness of civic duties, that may act as a counterweight on some of this extremism. Another hope that we focus on is the role of lawyers in this. We've seen lawyers act for ill. We have John Eastman presenting a blueprint to the president on how to overturn the 2020 election and not certify the votes. And then we have lawyers who have done extraordinary things and like yourself, care deeply about the rule of law and serve as sort of—
I confess to being an institutionalist.
Right. As sort of the guardrails on our democracy. But it requires that we teach people the right way. And how do we do that? And is it foolish to think—
Why don't we, I think we should make every citizen, and including but not limited to every candidate for president, go through the same legal education that a person who is naturalized to this country goes through. My wife and I are helping a blind woman who lives in Brooklyn, New York. She's blind, from Africa. Prepare for naturalization. So I'm and she's blind. She cannot read this except listening to me. I'm teaching her what separation of powers means, how many members of the House there are, how many members of the Senate there are, what an electoral college is. I mean, wouldn't it be nice if we insisted on that for every citizen? I know you get it in 4th grade, but maybe a refresher course.
And indeed
once you decide to run for the House of Representatives, I'm convinced
absolutely
that there are people today in our Congress who do not understand separation of powers.
Well,
I know that there are people in our Congress who do not know what the chain of command is. So,
So the Annenberg Public Policy puts out a survey every year, a very well attended to survey, which showed interestingly that the knowledge of the structure of our Constitution, civic knowledge, increased during the Trump years and has decreased again now. So that's one
doesn't
thing that
that
we
doesn't
have to
surprise me. Right.
thank Donald Trump for, was people started paying attention to our constitutional
surprise me.
structure and our constitutional law. So in there must be some recipe. One of the things we've
Incidentally, one of the part and parcel of training to be an officer in the United States military
that's just where I was going.
is a basic understanding of our Constitution, our constitutional norms, the role of the military, posse comitatus. You know, my son is a member of the U.S. Coast Guard, and he is required to memorize statutes, whole statutes, to do his job. And which is why when there was that moment in June of 2020, when it looked like the military was getting dragged into domestic civil law enforcement, that you had such a sharp reaction from retired four-stars,
Yes.
because this is so core to them and their very fiber and their education to be in the United States military. You saw that reaction. And it's one of the reasons I believe our military is one of the most respected institutions in the country, because we keep it, it's the mightiest military in the world, and but we keep it cabined to overseas engagements, not domestic civil law enforcement.
Right. Now, one of the worrisome things to come out of January 6th, however, is that veterans were comparably overrepresented in the crowd that took the Capitol by storm. Active duty military, not so much, but it's unclear. We still don't know. If you judge by prosecution rates, I think the figure I last heard was about a dozen active duty military may have been prosecuted. How worried should we be about the results coming out about our veterans communities?
So, look, we're all a product of our own experience. I have two reactions. One, anyone who was in the U.S. military and who would then engage in what happened on January 6th never really was a true member of the U.S. military, a full, a fully fledged, cognizant member of our U.S. military and what it stands for. We're all a product of our own experience. In my time working at the Pentagon, and in my experience with the U.S. military, and I dealt with some of the greatest members of our military of our time. And I dealt with a lot of just day-to-day colonels and lieutenant colonels and captains and majors. These are people who are dedicated, conscientious, mature people who are patriotic and want to serve their country and always do the right thing and have a very rigid sense of right and wrong and a code of ethics. And so but that's the people I dealt with, from 2004 on up to 2010. So someone who was in our military who would then engage in January 6th is not within my experience, but there, anything is possible. And, there's a lot of stuff you just can't make up.
Well,
As I said earlier, there are a lot of interesting facts about the demographics of those who engaged in the insurrection.
I want to let our audience in, but there's one story I got to ask you. There's a television show I love called Designated Survivor. And it's actually brilliant. And it's really fascinating because actually it shows a lot about domestic violence, extremism, and efforts to undercut the legitimate government. But you were a designated survivor. Twice.
Twice.
Okay, and you promised to tell us a story about that, so.
So for anybody here who doesn't know, the presidential chain of command in this country is president, vice president, speaker of the House, president pro tem of the Senate, and you have to learn, I think you have to learn this to be naturalized, and then the cabinet in the order of the seniority of the cabinet department you lead. So because the Department of Homeland Security is the newest cabinet department, created in 2002, and I was the secretary, I was in the presidential chain of command, but I was last. There was nobody behind me, which surprised me. I thought that it just kept going, you know, deputy secretaries, undersecretaries, until you got to, you know, some GS-13 someplace. But no, it stops. It stopped with me, which I felt that pressure. But anyway, you cannot put all of those people in the same place at the same time. One person in that group has to absent themselves, whether it's an inauguration or a State of the Union. One person needs to absent them in case of catastrophe. Otherwise, there's nobody left except maybe the US Army to take over. So one person has to absent themselves, and that person is always designated in advance. And first time I got this was January 2016, the State of the Union, which I was, you know, I really liked going to State of the Union because you're there on the House floor with the Supreme Court and the president and the vice president and the entire Congress, and I got a seat right in front of Mitch McConnell, and you get to wave to mom on C-SPAN 6 and watch the Supreme Court justices go to sleep. But the reality is that when you're in the cabinet, your role is to be a cheerleader. You're supposed to stand up and clap. You know, every sentence from the president is an applause line. So your job is to, you know, constantly. My knees were tired after an hour. But anyway, I got sent away on January 2016 to the undisclosed location, which is still undisclosed, so I can't disclose it. And I'm sitting there watching, this is designated survivor number 1. I'm sitting there watching, and on TV, I'm watching this, the run-up to the speech. And I thought that the fact that I was the designated survivor was this super secret thing. And I'm watching Chris Matthews on MSNBC, and we've just been handed a bulletin that Jeh Johnson is the designated survivor tonight. And then he had this great line. He said, well, that makes sense, since no presidency named Johnson begins well. And then I got the short straw the second time for the inauguration in 2017. And I had it all planned, how I was going to leave office. I had an app on this phone that counted down the days, hours, minutes till January 2017 at noon, when I was going to expire. And I had submitted my resignation a year in advance because I knew that's when I was leaving. And I was going to, at exactly noon, push back from my desk, wave goodbye to the Secret Service protection detail that I had for 3 years, get in my own car, and drive up 95 New Jersey Turnpike to my home in Montclair, New Jersey, and wake up the next morning a normal person on January 21st. That didn't happen. I got tasked to be the designated survivor, and they said, this time, all you need to do is just leave Washington a day early and go home to Montclair, and you'll have a larger than usual security detail around you, because I'm fourth in line or third in line for the presidency. Doesn't happen too much. You go from third in line to the presidency in an instant to being a private citizen. But on Inauguration Day, it's different because everybody else in the chain of command is resigning, and there's no new cabinet at 12:01 on January 2017 until the Senate confirms these people. So that means I had to stay with the permission of the president-elect, I had to stay into the Trump administration. And for 7 hours and 32 minutes, until 7:32 on that Friday night, I was the entirety of Donald Trump's cabinet. A law professor came up to me one day and said, why didn't you invoke the 25th Amendment when you had the chance? You're half of yourself. The question is whether actings could invoke the 25th Amendment. I think that's an open question, but anyway. So I went out with a flourish.
Excellent story. Let's open it up to
The next day, I got on the New York City subway and I just rode it for 12 hours. It was wonderful.
All right. Do we have microphones for member? Oh, we've got a microphone over here. Maybe we can put that in the center aisle or you're going to pass it around, one or the other?
We can pass it.
Okay, we can pass it around. Great. So go ahead.
Thank you. You touched on this a little bit earlier, but I wanted to talk about the legal community and sort of the mechanisms of accountability following the 2020 election. There have been a lot of people, and this isn't just for the Eastmans of the world, but there have been a lot of people concerned that there hasn't been that much accountability for lawyers who pursued frivolous claims that they knew to be frivolous in state courts and such. And I was just wondering if you could touch on that and, if the bar has enough mechanisms for accountability to pursue that.
I think we do if we're willing to use them. And we're kind of seeing this now with the Mar-a-Lago investigation. The lawyers are not willing to just spout off in court or court filings anything that Donald Trump wants them to say. They are tethered to the truth with what they say in court. So the lawyers are more careful. We do have mechanisms if we're willing to use them, but the abuses in the last days of the Trump administration, this is what happens when a president surrounds himself with bad lawyers who are willing to tell him what he wants to hear and spout off any creative legal theory they can dream up that the president decides to embrace as legal reality. And that's a lot of what happened. On January 6th, this is what, when the Trump administration began, there were guardrails. There were people of character and integrity like John Kelly and Jim Mattis who were willing to step up, serve the country, and serve as guardrails and hope that this new president would listen to them because they're far more experienced. Systematically, one by one, they were all driven out of office to the point where on January 6, 2017, we had an acting attorney general, an acting secretary of defense, and an acting secretary of Homeland Security, and nobody in this room can name them because they were all there basically on a job interview and with no job security. And this is what happens when you have that kind of form of government in place.
On the accountability issue, let me just say we have a long history of this, right? We had a extensive use of torture in Guantanamo and at other sites, and lawyers were involved in putting that in place, and we have not had any investigation of the lawyers or accountability for that program. And what can be done about it? We have to look also to bar associations and the role that they play. Rudy Giuliani had his law license temporarily suspended in New York, but in general, bar associations have not been aggressive in sanctioning lawyers and particularly not aggressive in removing their licenses to practice. So we may need reform in a lot of different areas to
Rudy Giuliani is suspended in New York State.
New York,
like his bar license.
Yeah, was suspended. So Duncan.
I have two very brief questions. First one is this: it seems like the January 6th so-called insurrection is the poster child for the dangers of domestic violent extremism, and yet not a single shot was fired in anger by the occupants. What is the meaning of that? And my second question is this: your Constitution is such that an awful lot of things are contested about what the president can and cannot do. And to an outsider, I'm a Canadian, where it's inconceivable these questions would even arise for the Prime Minister of my country. He's just a person, he doesn't have any extraordinary powers. It seems like you're stuck with it. And a lot of the stuff, I have a PhD in philosophy, and I'm struggling to understand the distinction between declassifying a document and declassifying information. And it sounds to me like this is just lawyer stuff, and you can't get them with just lawyer stuff. So first question, why were no bullets fired by the insurrectionists? And second, isn't this just lawyer stuff and you can't get them?
I'm going to start with the second question. I thought you were going in a different direction. Yes, there's a lot of vagueness in our Constitution. There's a lot of gray. And we've been lucky through the history of this republic because we've elected people as president who respected the gray, who respected constitutional norms, even though the letter of the Constitution may not give you the clear answer. Even Richard Nixon in 1960 knew he had to concede because he didn't want to cast doubt on the gray aspects of our democracy. Even though every last ballot wasn't counted, even though he believed that it was stolen in Illinois, he knew that to adhere to democratic norms, he needed to concede the presidency so that we all knew who the president was going to be. So we've been lucky up to now. I wouldn't say that taking and keeping vital national security information for yourself is lawyer stuff. I think that's just simply an abuse of power, plain and simple. With respect to January 6th, I think it was a tragedy, but I also think we were remarkably lucky in that no shots were fired. I mean, we know from the committee hearings that some of these people were armed. It's a miracle that no shots were fired. I think if it had gone on much longer, it would have gotten more violent because of a mob mentality. A mob mentality is to burn the entire house down, and when it's obliterated and it's in ashes, then they go away. I think we were very, very lucky that no member of Congress was injured. I think they would have killed Nancy Pelosi if they had found her. I think they would have seriously hurt the vice president if they had found him. I think it's a credit to the Secret Service that he was not harmed. So we were, in many respects, we were very lucky that day, and that's all it was luck and some skill by some very dedicated Capitol Police who put their own bodies on the line, and some very skilled, trained Secret Service.
I believe there was also an important moment where there were metal detectors around the Capitol building that Donald Trump tried to have removed if the information of the January 6th committee is
around the rally at the White House.
around the rally.
He said, well, let them, they're armed, but they're not here to shoot me, so it's okay.
Right, and that actually his order to have the metal detectors removed was countermanded, ignored. So we also perhaps owe it to that act of defiance, because that might have made a big difference. Others, Elizabeth. But to take the mic so that people on the remote.
Just to add to that, I believe what we're learning is that Stuart Rhodes was in charge of a cache of weapons that could have been called upon. So again, luck comes in here. What?
The head of the Oath Keepers.
The head of the Oath Keepers. Interestingly, a Yale
Speak a little more into the mic, if you would, Elizabeth.
Interestingly, a Yale Law School graduate. I've been very disturbed at the fact that some of our most elite law schools have produced some of this really very misguided, would be the best I could say of this. I did want, though, Secretary Johnson, to offer one thought about your comment about our military and the lawyers. I would tell you that I have the zeal of the converted when it comes to the JAG Corps. They truly are wonderful, and I feel similarly about the leadership. But the military is not all at the level perhaps you and I have dealt with them. And as one colleague who was a JAG herself said, we take the Corps, if you will, those folks who come in an enlisted way, we take what we get. And what we get is a population that has had in many cases, almost no civic education. And I would tie that to the other point you made about guardrails. I think what we're learning is that our Constitution, the black letter law in that Constitution, is not enough. What we have to have is an appreciation of the norms and the ethics and the conduct that is required to make this work. And that, I think, is where civic education might contribute and where we are so vulnerable. So just to add a few thoughts, and thank you for the comments you've made.
I think both points are fair.
We may have some questions from our online audience, so let me give a chance to those before I take further questions from the House.
Okay, this is one of the online questions. Your hypothesis, Trump's attorneys lied knowingly versus weren't smart enough to not ask Trump if he had lied to them and they innocently propagated this alternative fact. Is there truth to the maxim that the defense attorneys do not want to know their client was guilty of the crime of which he or she has been accused?
Does the questioner really think that if Donald Trump tells his attorney something, the attorney doesn't know to be skeptical? I've been a lawyer 40 years. I have known personalities like Trump's. New York real estate. I kind of know people like him, although there's nobody at his level that I've ever met in my life. But I kind of know people like that. And with certain clients, you got to verify before you're willing to put your name to something and put your reputation, your bar admission on the line to make a representation on behalf of the client. It's just common sense forged by a lot of experience. You don't just accept the word of what your client tells you if you have pretty good reason to suspect that your client's word is not all that good. You can't just say, well, this is what the client told me. That verification, by the way, that certification that was signed, I mean, it was pretty carefully worded. So far as I know, my client told me, it was caveated in some way. It wasn't, there are no classified documents left on this site. It was pretty, but even what was said turned out to have been wrong, so.
Okay, another question from the House? Yes?
It's been a pleasure listening to you, Mr. Secretary. I have a question which is more theoretical. And a theoretical question seems to be essential in today's world. And that is, under what conditions is no one above the rule of law?
When you have a monarchy. The question is, under what circumstances is there a
No
rule?
one is above the rule of law.
No one's above.
Everyone is.
Well, when you have a monarchy, the monarch is above the law. That's about it, right? I mean, would you agree?
Theoretically, it's only under the laws of nature. That's what my work is on, and hence my position that it's only unless it is dictated, it's only under the in a democracy, which is ideal, that one can have no one above the rule of law.
And we have a question back here from Harvey Rishkoff.
Hey, Jay.
Hi, Harvey.
Thank you for doing this. It's really, really great. So I'm going to give you a hard and easy question. And the question is, we are the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law. You've had an extraordinary distinguished career of public service. What is the greatest ethical challenge you experienced as an attorney in service? What was it and how did you resolve it?
With the students, I talked about one such challenge that involved Guantanamo. In a general sense, I think that the greatest challenge a lawyer has ethically is when doing the right thing according to your own code of ethics may be at odds with your legal training. And I think that circumstance is rare. Hopefully it never occurs to a member of the bar. Hopefully it never happens to such a person, but sometimes there may be instances where the ethical thing is at odds with what you've been trained legally to do. In the military, in civilian life, or otherwise. And I think the answer to that quagmire is, if you are convinced that what you are doing is the right thing and the ethical thing, but it may not necessarily be the legal thing, then you have to be prepared to accept the consequences of your actions. So, is it ethical to violate a state court injunction that bars you from marching from Selma to Montgomery to win the right to vote? Many would argue that it is, as long as you are prepared to accept the consequences and go to jail. Is it ethical to leak a classified document or reveal the existence of a classified program when it might be illegal to do that, but you have some sense of the greater good? I'm not arguing that such a person should ever do this, but in some people's minds, it's the ethical thing to do, to reveal something classified, as long as you're willing to accept the consequences and not flee to another country. That's my best effort at the answer to your question.
One more from Duncan.
I think we would all agree that the following is a mistake in law: to see that somebody's done something and then make up a law according to which it's illegal and then charge them with it. So the law is not supposed to be retroactive that way. Suppose the Constitution or some law that Trump is allowed to have violated is fuzzy. It's contested. And you're going to have to decide whether or not what he did was a violation or whether or not there was such a law. It seems unreasonable, isn't it, to then charge him with it? So if the law is unclear about something, you can't just clarify it in a certain direction in order to get a guy, is what I'm saying.
Yes. So in a high stakes, nationally visible prosecution, where people may take to the streets depending upon the result, you better be darn sure that what you're doing will lead to a conviction of some sort. And this kind of goes back to what I said earlier. And I'm not entirely sure how I would come out on this question, armed with all of the evidence and information that somebody sitting at the Department of Justice would have. If my choice is to indict a former president for a clear violation of what some people might say is a kind of a lawyer thing, a technical violation of the Espionage Act because I didn't give back all the classified documents. If my choice is to go for the easy win and overlook the national outrage over an insurrection on our U.S. Capitol, which many would say was incited by Donald Trump, I would, if I were sitting in the Attorney General's chair, I'd say that's not the right result. The Insurrection Act is rarely charged, but it's on the books for a reason. Right. And yeah, there'll be a First Amendment defense, but isn't there a duty to, call something what it is and not walk away from it because there's some other lesser offense that you can get this person on? So that's kind of how I see it. So if I were the Attorney General and the lawyers came to me and said, seditious conspiracy or insurrection, giving aid and comfort to an insurrection, that's a reach and that's a gamble. But we do have this other espionage violation here based on Mar-a-Lago, which we've stumbled upon why don't we go after him for that? I'd say, well, wait a minute. I'm not sure that's the right calculus here. That's kind of, that would be my inclination. But again, I have the benefit of being a private citizen, talking at forums like this. I don't have the responsibility for making these choices.
So we only have a few minutes left. One more? Okay, one more from
Sorry,
a
just as a
Penn
quick
Law student.
Yeah, just as a quick follow-on question, and thank you again for your time today. So do you think that continued attempts at prosecuting someone like Donald Trump kind of undermines our democratic institutions, especially if he's not ended up convicted due to our failures as a political system or as a society to actually implement the charges that he's been given?
Okay, good question.
Yeah, good question. So
If you
two
shoot at a
attempts-
king, you better bring him down, is your
right,
point.
if you
you
shoot
better
the
not
king,
miss
you
the
better
mark.
kill the king. Right. It's a poor analogy, but so there were two attempts. There were two impeachments and two acquittals of Donald Trump in our Congress. Many would argue that, he didn't deserve to be impeached, and, the right result was reached, and it's all a witch hunt out to get him, and we're normalizing impeachment. And I think there is something to that. Congress did not go down the road of trying to impeach Donald Trump over the Russia stuff. It was Ukraine, and then it was January 6th. I happen to believe that if the Republicans in the Senate had voted what they truly thought, there would have been 2/3 to convict, but they didn't. I'm going to answer yes to your question, because after a while, it looks as though people are trying to bring him down for the sake of bringing him down, and they keep failing each time. So yes, that does tend, it would, in the eyes of many in this country, tend to undermine criminal justice.
Which is perhaps a fact that Merrick Garland is very well aware of.
Correct. It would be the highest stakes prosecution in this country in I don't know how long.
Let's close by, if you would, give us just a few thoughts on the Russia-Ukraine situation, because here we are in this enormous, and I know it's not exactly your remit, but with your experience and knowledge and Homeland Security, it would be very interesting to hear your thoughts, especially at the current moment with the pipeline bombing and the warning on the part of the US government that all Americans should get out of Russia.
So none of us here could truly know what is going on, because we don't get to read daily intelligence reports about what's happening inside Russia, what's happening inside the Kremlin, what Vladimir Putin's, what the best effort is, his thinking is, what the stakes are, what's happening in Ukraine. None of us can be fully informed about that. From what I see, if you had asked me this question a couple months ago, I would have said it's going to end in a stalemate of sorts, where he occupies part of the country, and there's a ceasefire, a tense ceasefire of sorts, occasioned by sporadic violence and attempts to take back a region or seize an additional region. What's happening in Ukraine I said this on like day 2 of the invasion, that a smaller, dedicated, courageous army dedicated to defending their families and their homeland and their very existence can do a whole lot more to outmaneuver a much larger army of conscripts that don't even know why they're there. And that's been the case for the last 6-7 months. The Ukrainian army has outmaneuvered the larger Russian bear now for a long time. No one would have predicted this. Anyone who says they would have predicted this, no one would have predicted this. They're defending their homeland, and it goes to a larger point that counterinsurgencies, invasion of another country's homeland is a real uphill climb, whether it's Ukraine, Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam. It's a lesson that rulers have to relearn over and over again very often. I do not take off the table the prospect of tactical nuclear weapons as Vladimir Putin becomes more desperate. I think we should be concerned about that possibility. I think we should be concerned about contamination at a nuclear power site. I think we definitely have to be concerned about more war atrocities, more violations, more war crimes. He invaded unprovoked and illegally invaded another country and is basically trying to redraw the map, the territorial maps. So I don't take anything off the table. And I think the Biden administration gets high marks for what it has done so far. They've been very disciplined in not being drawn into a direct military confrontation with Russia, and have drawn a line while imposing sanctions. And I think that ultimately, this is going to cost Vladimir Putin's presidency. Not tomorrow, not next month, but ultimately, this will cost him his presidency, and this will be his legacy.
Secretary Johnson, we thank you so much for being here today and for your extraordinary leadership and service to the country. Please join me. We are adjourned.